We kind of discussed like what's the view of America and Americans towards China. But what about how do you think Chinese people see Americans? Like average Chinese, what do you think about America? Are they threatened by America, or they curious, or they don't care?
Combination of the three, not to sort of evade the question, but no, I mean, here's the best way I try to explain it is you see all of the media headlines, and it's very clear in the United States that China is living, as we like to say, like rent free in everybody's mind, like this big bad evil empire. And in China, when you ask like, hey, America, what do you think? And they're like, yeah, people are too busy dealing with whatever they're having to deal with on a Wednesday. It's just a day.
Yeah.
I think there's a fascination, if you will, of what's going on with the Trump administration, and I'll get questions from time to time. But ultimately, we're talking about China that over the course of my 30 years, there have been some serious events that have taken place. I can tell you when I first got here after a couple of months was in March of 1996. Taiwan was having its first election, and the Chinese started throwing bombs into the Taiwan Strait, like to try and intimidate. And now keep in mind, there was no internet then, not in China. Like we were like sitting around outside at a restaurant, a bunch of us, and the waitress came up in Chinese and asked us whether or not the United States and China were going to war. And we looked around like, what is going on? So, we've had, it's called the third Taiwan crisis, by the way. We had that issue. We had the Americans, quote unquote, accidentally bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade back in 1998. There was a spy plane that crashed in Hainan Island in 2001. So there has been flashpoints, if you will, in the relationship in the time that I've been here. But here's the most important difference, Max. Prior to 2015 or so, Americans didn't really care, didn't even think twice about China. Wasn't even in their mind. And all of a sudden, it just occurred to an increasing number of people in the United States. Oh my God, look at China right now. They're eating our lunch. We need to do something about it. So for the Chinese, over that same period of time, it's just been progress, 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 progress. I'm gonna do what I have to do during the day. I'm gonna take care of my family. I'm gonna go to work. I'm gonna try to make a bit more money. Very, I would say, basic human standards. They're not really involved in the politics of it all.
Interesting. That's what I heard from other people as well. So like sometimes we kind of it's overall I think it's in human nature. We sometimes exaggerate the role of ourselves and like how much other people think about us. And it's also applied
Yep.
to the countries, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you said before that China wanna be a big guy in its playground, which is Asia. If like some American, like average American, ask you like, okay, they control Asia, and now they actually want like the global domination. Like what would you say?
Well, the first question I ask is why? There's empire, and then there's, I think, just broad success. And I think if you look at, I'll give you a classic example that I would answer is say, there is this 20th century, very Cold War mindset of, we have the G7, and everybody's now talking about China and the United States as the G2. China wants none of that. Their outlook is not about you're either with us or against us. And I think it's fascinating where even Donald Trump said during the beginning of this whole trade war issue, you're going to have to pick. You're either with us or with China. And China's mentality has always been, look, if your allegiance is number one to the United States, that's fine. We understand that. But just because you're aligned with the United States does not mean that you have to make us your enemy. Like you can have it both ways. The
Mm.
United States does not operate in that way. I would even argue in the previous empire that is the United Kingdom, there was also a very similar, call it really a scarcity mentality. The Chinese, on the other hand, their outlook is, look, we don't need bases around the world. We don't need to influence, elections here, there, and everywhere. What China truly is looking for, and maybe this is not great either, is a much more mercantilist relationship with partners, where they're saying, look, if we're going to sell to you or you're going to buy from us, we want it to be not about power per se. We're just in it to try and make money. We're trying to build our country. We're trying to provide for our society. And if Italy wants us to come in and build a port for them, we're happy to do so if it makes economic sense. And then the United States comes in and says, "No, Italy, you can't do that. You're part of NATO. This is bad." Or a Hong Kong company that is deemed to be Chinese, CK Ports, which own the ports in Panama, the United States comes down and says, "This is a national security issue." It's like, okay. China's always out looking, saying, "Yeah, we're not here to try to stop commerce going through the Panama Canal. No, we're doing it because we think we can make money off of it." Now, again, a mercantilist mentality isn't great, but I think it's also important to recognize that doesn't equal a hegemon in the making. We take over Asia, then we take over the world. I don't see any logic that supports that thinking unless you're an American, and if you only understand that the world has been sort of run from Western powers using the hegemon system, I don't know, for 500-600 years, of course, you're going to think the next group is going to do the same thing. Doesn't necessarily need to be the case. China is a very different animal.
How would you compare life in Shanghai versus life in New York City?
What's interesting about that is over the course of the time that I've been in China, I have periodically gone back to the US once at least, maybe twice a year. And again, most of the time going back to the Northeast, to the New York area. And the reason why I think it's a fascinating question to ask is it gave me the opportunity to sort of benchmark each year. And I could see, shouldn't say you, but I could see that there were changes underway that the best way I could sort of frame it is it was becoming more restrictive in terms of the opportunity set. When I was there in the early 90s, it was still a pretty cowboy centric environment in New York. If you put the time in, if you did the daily grind, if you tried to network a bit, you could do a lot. You could get a lot of opportunities. And
Yeah.
then I kept finding through conversations and whatnot that you began to see gatekeepers were being put into place. If you didn't know the right people or didn't go to the right schools, it became increasingly difficult. So the opportunity set as time went on became very apparent to me that it wasn't the same as it was back in the 90s. But then at the same time, people themselves, I don't want to say they gave up, but there was this, how do I define it? A reluctance to really put in the energy, sort of a why even
Mm.
bother? Meanwhile, being, 11 and a half months, let's say, out of the year in China, none of that existed. Everybody was working aggressively, whatever they could do, wherever the opportunity existed. And it was just increasingly a night and day experience.
Why do you think is that? It's like the bigger waves and the bigger trends that were happening in the US and in China, or it's a cultural aspect into it as well? Like, what do you think?
It's one of those answers that I think will depend on the individual. And for me, and again, I think it's important to keep in mind that throughout this whole period of time, I'm more the outsider looking into the United States versus sort of being there. So I've always been a little bit cautious when I'm trying to look at the United States and try to ask myself the question, what happened? To give you a bit of a benchmark, I've always considered myself, and I think this is accurate, a child of Ronald Reagan. My most formative years were from 1980 to 1988. And at the time, the United States was, call it more of a, to use a more modern term, an abundance mentality. You could go out, you could do, you could create. There was just opportunity galore. And I think that continued well into the 1990s. But, you could make the point that at 9/11, at the turning point when the towers came down in New York, the United States shifted towards its war on terror. And I think that this shifted a lot of the focus by especially the American decision makers in Washington in an area that I guess rightly at the time they viewed as being the most important priority. But during a 20-year period, call it from 2000 to 2020 or thereabouts, the United States was very preoccupied with sort of the geopolitical priorities that they thought were critical. China, on the other hand, just got to work, and
Mm.
they looked at building, they looked at creating, they spent an enormous amount on infrastructure. The individuals would go to college, they would try to get jobs. I mean, it was a very euphoric, I think, a period during China. Whereas, for at least my perspective, unfortunately, the United States made the error in terms of its strategic outlook. And then ultimately, let's call it 2015 or 16, with the ascension of Donald Trump, the first time around, it was the first time where all of a sudden you saw throughout America that China was, in fact, a rival, a competitor. And on a
Yeah.
dime, everything began to change at that point.